Welcome. I'm Mark Robbins, the Dean of the School of Architecture. I figure most of these are familiar faces. Well, thanks for coming and braving the weather. You know, downstate, this is what everybody thinks we live with daily. So I'm glad at least now I can talk about great snowdrifts. Pat and Morton, is our speaker tonight, had the pluck to come in from Los Angeles. So one can only imagine the juxtaposition of palm trees and this within a 12-hour. So thank you, Pat, for coming. Tonight is our annual Hares Lecture, and this lecture is dedicated to Frances Hares, and it generally has to do with issues related to preservation. And I was very excited after talking to Pat about some of her current work in inviting Pat Morton to give the Hares Lecture. Interestingly enough, we had met initially at the office of James Stewart Polshek and Partners in New York in the wee 80s, when we were working actually on the renovation of a historic structure, Carnegie Hall. And we worked on that for several years. So Pat and I can actually talk about synthetic terracotta products and matching mortar types. And if any of you have questions about that, I'm sure you'll ask. But I've asked Mark Linder tonight to do a more formal introduction of Pat, someone who's a remarkable historian and theorist, and many of you remember a glowing review of her book in the New York Times of Hybrid Modernities, where Herbert Muschamp, who generally doesn't wax poetic about theory, actually did. And with that, I'll ask Mark Linder to introduce Pat.
Well, thanks. It's obviously a great pleasure to do this, and unfortunately, we don't have the huge crowds we normally have, but I feel like I shouldn't forego any of the pomp and circumstance and formality that any introduction should have. So here we go. As Mark mentioned, Pat's here from Los Angeles, where she is associate professor and chair of the Department of Art History at UC Riverside. And we were joking a little bit earlier that Pat really doesn't need an introduction here today because she's a friend and a colleague of probably what seems like at least half of our faculty, which is a testament to her truly extraordinary skills as a scholar, an administrator, and in fact a hostess. So it's a great pleasure to have her here today and to be her host at Syracuse Architecture, even with the weather. But and you may be the only one who knows what I'm talking about here, or Julia, or a few others, but and Jonathan. But getting here in a blizzard is really nothing compared to getting to Riverside on a rainy day at rush hour. So there are a lot of reasons why Pat's here today, other than the ones that Mark mentioned, in addition to the ones that Mark mentioned, in part because she exemplifies the kind of scholarship that we're celebrating so often here at Syracuse, this notion of scholarship in action. In addition to this incredibly productive life as a scholar and a chair of a program, she's also the faculty director of something called the Barbara and Art Culver Center for the Arts, which is an interactive arts center, an educational facility in downtown Riverside that is open to both students and the public, the idea being to facilitate or enhance the presence of the university in the city, as well as to promote the arts and the work of the university in the community as well. She's also on the academic advisory board for Riverside's Blakely Center for Sustainable Suburban Development, which sounds fascinating.
It's an oxymoron.
You do what you can, right? So the subject and title of her talk, Setting Up Camp, as you can see on the wall, is a sample of her ongoing research to uncover and scrutinize the 60s sources of postmodern taste, specifically to make historical connections between what we often call POMO taste in the late 70s and early 80s and the camp sensibility of the 1960s. Susan Sontag famously in 1964 characterized camp, and maybe you're going to go over all this, so I'll save you a little time. Famously characterized camp as a not quite natural mode of sensibility. The essence of camp is its love of the unnatural, of artifice and exaggeration. Camp is esoteric, something of a private code, a badge of identity even, among small urban cliques. And you can imagine she's talking about postmodern architecture as well. So the fact is, I think, that Pat is particularly qualified to pursue this research, which was reinforced with a vengeance, really, when I looked at the 1983 issue of Précis, the Columbia Journal of Architecture that she co-edited. And I had these flashbacks to a very particular version of postmodern taste that at that time permeated the Eastern architectural establishment, including the school and many of the institutions at which our faculty were educated. This pervasive taste culture in architecture with Robert Stern at one end and Alan Calhoun at the other, encompassing a design sensibility that was by no means camp, but which was an amalgam of camps. Americanist, historicist, typologist, formalist, and so on. And I should also note that Pat's editing a Festschrift in honor of Alan Calhoun, an important project. So we might argue that Calhoun and Stern represent the good taste side of postmodernism, and the Californian Charles Moore, who she'll talk about today, represents a counter taste culture that was distinctly kitsch and populist. And now that she resides in California, I imagine that she, as much as anyone, sees both sides and thus fulfills Sontag's claim that to name a sensibility, to draw its contours, and to recount its history requires a deep affinity, a deep sympathy modified by revulsion. But seriously, this current project that we'll see a bit of today comes after sustained research and writing fueled by her PhD work at Princeton in the 90s on issues of colonialism, race, and gender. And Pat has truly been a leading figure in those areas, in architectural history and theory. Her 2000 book that Mark mentioned on the 1931 colonial exposition in Paris, Hybrid Modernities, argues that despite attempts by colonial powers to heighten our belief in the superiority of Western rationality and civilization, by contrasting it with Orientalist representations of the rampant sensuality, this is a quote from her book, the rampant sensuality, decadence, and irrationality of the colonies, the eventual effect of such expositions was to produce new hybrids between European cultures and those of their colonies. So her subsequent work has expanded this investigation of race, gender, and marginality. And in a series of essays published in journals like Art Bulletin, Casabella, Journal of Architectural Education, Design Book Review, and at least two people know about this one, a journal called Oz. Her essays have appeared in several significant anthologies as well. The Feminism and Visual Culture Reader, an essay called Consuming the Colonies, and a book called Eating Architecture. A visit to the Woman House in Architecture of the Everyday. And she's working on, as the editor, a new book called Pop Culture and Post-War American Taste, a book in the Blackwell series, New Interventions in Art History. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Pat here today. I hope you also warmly welcome her.
Well, my God, when you hear all that, you think, wow. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming on this snowy day. And believe it or not, I'm actually really enjoying this weather because it's a change from the really banal and monotonous weather of Los Angeles. So this is probably one of the toughest audiences I've faced because there's so many people here who I respect and have known for so long, and the prospect of presenting something to your faculty is quite daunting, but I'm also really delighted to be here and really look forward to giving you a little taste, as it were, a camp taste of a project I'm doing now on bad taste in the 60s and 70s. And this is really a condensed version, so I'm hoping that we'll have some questions. You'll have questions and I can elaborate because I've cut a lot of stuff out. But his introduction had the advantage of, let's see, giving the first part of my lecture. So, oh,
This
one.
is forward and back. There's your pointer.
Right, get the
there.
light.
Okay.
Can everybody hear back there?
Can you see your text?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But I'm afraid that this may be the old version. All right. So here's Susan Sontag. I do have to start with Susan Sontag. In 1964, she published Notes on Camp, which was the canonical essay on camp, in which he defined the logic of Kant's sensibility and said, defined it as a certain mode of aestheticism, a way of seeing the world as an aesthetic phenomenon through artifice and stylization. For Sontag, camp turns its back on the good-bad axis of ordinary aesthetic judgment and emphasizes fantasy and extravagance over seriousness and control. It's a vision of the world in terms of style, as she said, but a particular kind of style. It is the love of the exaggerated, the off, of things being what they are not, which is with all hyphens. According to her, among her examples of camp were early 18th century art, but probably more significantly for the period I'm interested in, the 60s, Art Nouveau, Tiffany lamps, Aubrey Beardsley drawings, Swan Lake, Visconti, La Lupe, Flash Gordon, and novels by Ronald Furbank and Ivy Compton Burnett, about which I will just let. Sontag believed that camp slighted content in emphasizing style, and that's incredibly important for this lecture. And therefore, it was depoliticized. It was disengaged and, at the very least, apolitical. She referred to camp as a private code among urban cliques, as Mark just said, which is a sidelong allusion to its origins in homosexual culture, in the subculture of camp. But she averred that it was much more than homosexual taste. Nevertheless, she posited a quote, peculiar relation between camp taste and homosexuality by dubbing homosexuals, quote, the vanguard and most articulate audience of camp. Sontag's essay helped disseminate camp into contemporary culture as a refined and apolitical aesthetic taste for the vulgar, such that it captured the mass media and became a popular fad. Here are several interiors that demonstrate this. In 1966, Time called camp a sort of tongue-in-cheek philosophy of pop culture and hinted that, quote, there's every expectation that grown men will be showing up at Andy Warhol's next party dressed like the Batman. And here's Baby Jane Holzer, about whom Tom Wolfe wrote that she lived in the world of high camp, a world of thin young men in an environment, a decor, an atmosphere so, how can one say it, so indefinably yellow book, so beyond pop art if you comprehend. And here's Baby Jane, and here's a party at the factory. So this historical moment of the mid-60s marked the rise of camp beyond its origins in homosexual culture into a mass phenomenon, which was based on theatricality, wit, artifice, double meanings, and exaggeration. In that same period, a number of architects deployed popping camp design strategies, intentionally or not, as part of the reaction against institutionalized modernism and part of the search for a more populist and popular architecture. And here I'm really pushing the limits of the definition of camp in order to talk about two of Sontag's categories, which are naive and deliberate camp. And I would put in the naive camp some architects who you wouldn't really ordinarily discuss as camp, such as Paul Rudolph here, in the Art and Architecture building. I'm really taking Tim Rohan's cue here. Tim wrote an article in the first issue of Grey Room in which he discusses the bush-hammered concrete at the Art and Architecture building as a kind of decoration and a sort of elaboration of architecture that Rudolph himself suppressed to some degree. So I'll just show you some of these images. Minoru Yamasaki would clearly fall into the naive camp, an architect who really sincerely believed that his architecture could further man's understanding of himself, kind of bolster civilization, etc. Here's his North Shore Congregation Israel temple, which I guess is outside of Detroit. I didn't put that in. Or Edward Durrell Stone, the Beckman Auditorium at Caltech being one of the really most florid examples of camp, I would say. Or even Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal, which looks incredibly contemporary today, and has a kind of exaggerated metaphor of flight, this bird metaphor, which is really, I think, beyond the limits of traditional good taste, and is part of this era's attempts to try to find meaning and symbolism beyond the strictures of modern good taste. Then in the deliberate camp, I would put Archigram, and this is the only non-American example that I'm giving, but I think they're useful as a touchstone of people who really use popular culture with their tongue firmly in their cheek. Robert Venturi, whose Vanna Venturi house, I think really, again, stretches the limits. Most of his work I would not define as camp, but I think this particular building, with its exaggerated elements, particularly the chimney, the false facade, these are all, I think, very camp strategies, design strategies. Then Charles Moore, about whom I'll speak more in a moment, and Philip Johnson, who is probably really the campiest of the camp architects, which, again, I'll discuss in more detail in a moment. Just as a kind of provocative idea, I'm not going to develop this theme today, but I do think that camp has great resonance with contemporary architecture today. And I think that there's this way in which the superficial, decorative, and self-consciously bad taste spirit of certain buildings does, in some cases, formally echo, but also I think there's a similar concern, especially for the surface and for the decorative, without being sincere per se. And so here's Greg Lynn's Slavin House, and the caption could read "separated at birth." I mean, there is a sort of strange formal comparison there to be made, at least. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to ask for some help because I think the wrong version of the lecture is on here. Yeah, let me just keep going and see how far I can get. I think the wrong version was on the computer, so we may have to shift a little bit. Maybe it's a better moment to do it now than later. Yeah, sorry. Sorry. There was an old version. Yeah, there was an old version that was on the computer, but I think the new version is on the stick.
And you want to switch to the old version?
No, to the new one.
I put the one on here that you indicated was on the stick, setting up camp. I'll get
Let me just keep going then and see.
I can get the stick and we can switch it real quick if you like.
Let me keep going and you can get it and, yeah, okay. I don't know. Is the stick in the office or?
Yep. I'll get it.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Sorry. This lecture outlines some of the ways that the gay subculture of camp subverted high-style modernism and traditional good taste and infiltrated architecture culture in the 60s and 70s. I'm going to look at the work of two architects, Charles Moore and Philip Johnson, who used camp sensibility to appropriate popular culture and produce a delightfully trashy, queer kind of postmodernism. I'm interested in work that is an inversion and a subversion of norms and conventions, and operates via parody, pastiche, and exaggeration, which are these three terms that are used again and again in reference to camp and its subversion of norms. Camp involves a kind of sensibility in which blank mimicry and a critical edge may coexist, and therefore resembles the postmodern parody that Frederick Jameson, Linda Hutchinson, and others have defined as a repetition with critical distance, that allows ironic signaling of difference at the very heart of similarity. And it's in that moment of parody, of the seeming repetition of something that seems familiar, that seems normal, that in fact the criticality emerges. And so I'm positing that that notion as part of what camp was in the 1960s, seeing that it does in fact signal the emergence of a different kind of taste, the postmodern taste that Mark discussed in the 70s. And what I'd look at today then are examples from the mid-60s, which we're really not used to necessarily using the postmodern label, and looking at the ways in which camp allowed for the emergence of this new kind of postmodernism. Sure, yeah. Maybe this is a good moment. We'll just see if, I'm sorry, we'll just see if this new version is on here. Oops, can't see. Yeah, okay.
Here, you need to use the mouse.
Oh, this one, okay.
Yeah. Okay, the one I chose was up higher. Setting up camp. Yeah, that's the one I chose. Is that the one?
Listed it, view it as a list and make that most of
I
current.
think it should be this one.
All right, but we need to
Oh, right.
transfer it to the hard drive. Okay. Well, then she can't advance it
Yeah, I need
because we
this.
only have the one USB.
There's only one USB thing, so yeah, sorry about that. Let me just go through the list and see if it's correct.
Put this back in and then you can advance it, okay?
Just can I hold this for a second and just go back to the list?
This is the new one?
Yeah.
Oh, you want to get out of that?
Yeah.
All right. And you want to go to the other one?
No, just let me do
Okay.
the list and see if the slides are correct. Yeah, this is it.
That's it. Okay. That's it.
Yeah.
Oh, you got it then.
Yeah, I actually had another couple of images that I wanted to show. So, yeah, just to say that this is yet another one of the images that I think shows the degree to which there's, if not a camp spirit actively operating in this moment, it certainly has some correspondence. So, all right. Thank you so much. Despite Sontag's insistence that camp is apolitical and not just, quote unquote, just homosexual taste, its connection to pre-Stonewall's homosexual subculture was fundamental both to its formation and to its popular reception, and to the contemporary queer theorists who have embraced it. Fabio Clado links camp's history before 1964 to a homosexual lingo, a way to communicate with those in the know without revealing one's homosexuality. By 1964, camp had a wider resonance, in part because of Sontag's essay, including the Teds and Mods' taste for forgotten subcultural forms from Victorian and Eduardo taste, androgynous figures of pop music like the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger or David Bowie, Andy Warhol's pop art and his superstars, and of course here's Andy, and a generalized snobby appreciation for low culture. Since the 60s, critics as disparate as Andrew Ross, Richard Dyer, and Sasha Torres have positioned camp as a means for understanding dominant norms of identity, for undermining dominant norms of identity, sexuality, and representation. And I'm not going to read this, but just to say that I'm using the words gay and queer, but I should note that they are historical terms. To use them in reference to pre-Stonewall events or people is anachronistic, and I recognize that. So I'm using that retrospectively in a historic sort of twist as critical terms, which have currency now, but which in this period that I'm talking about were not widely used outside of homosexual circles. But it's such a clunky term to say homosexual every time I mean gay that I'm using a kind of shorthand. Following queer theorist Sasha Torres, I interrogate the complexities of the interface between subcultural style and its more mainstream appropriations. And I ask fairly obvious historical questions about the role of gay taste, not only in the important political and artistic movements of the 1960 counterculture, like pop, but also in the mass cultural popularizations and cannibalizations of these movements, like camp. I'm not raising an issue of personal identity here. I'm not trying to out these architects or talk about their sexual orientation or their personal lives, but I'm rather looking at the dissemination of camp representational strategies and codes in the dominant culture, architecture included. In architecture culture, camp entered critical parlance as a catch-all for styles appropriating the vulgar bad taste of popular culture. C. Ray Smith, who was an editor of progressive architecture in the late 60s and 70s, rooted camp in, quote, the witty recognition and ironic acceptance of the visual environment of our ordinary daily life, the popular culture that motivated pop art. He called camp a basic attitude, a detached aesthetic vision that permits reversals of judgment, from good to bad, from bad to fun, from serious to humorous. Perverseness with the goal of humor is its core. And these are two images. Actually, the one on the left is an image from Supermannerism, which is his book from 1977 that codified and collected all of the work that he characterized as camp pop, and sort of created this term, Supermannerism, because he felt that it was like the mannerism of Baroque, kind of revitalized and popularized. And I'll talk about this. This is Charles Moore's house in Essex. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Charles Jenks, in Modern Movements in Architecture, used the term camp as a sweeping pejorative category to encompass a broad spectrum of buildings influenced by popular culture. He included a chapter called Camp Non-Camp that calls camp failed seriousness. And he saw it manifested in these various isms that he created, formalism, aestheticism, classicism, pragmatism, and what he called chaoticism. And these are two diagrams which unfortunately have pixelated out of control. But camp is up here. Can't skip it all. Camp is here. This is con, and this is more. And then this is a chart. God only knows how you read this chart, but it's essentially lists these various architects. It creates this diagram, which he never fully explains, so it's not clear what the numbers are referring to. It's from 1 to 12, or rather 13. But I think that it's, then on the side, there's this explanation that there are these various schools, which are first camp. The first two schools are camp, the academic and the environmentalist school, and then the rest are non-camp. And this sort of camp and non-camp is a somewhat strange set of two strange categories in a sense. He defines camp as morally cool, pretty, the product of overheated urban society, which again is a kind of code for, for homosexual culture, for the kind of urban marginal culture Whereas he says non-camp is morally hot, a flower with odor rather than a pretty object, and is the product of an underheated rural or academic place. Clearly referring to places like Yale, I think. Or perhaps even Syracuse. His stance was anti-pluralist and revealed latent hostility toward camps and pop's relation to mass culture. The camp object, in Jenks's view, must be univalent, have a single kind of universalizing meaning. And it was the work of intellect and fancy that was amoral and destructive of the public realm. Philip Johnson's work, for example, is, quote, entirely camp. It displays what Jenks called an impeccably perverse taste, motivated by historicist delusions. Of course, again, perverse is another sidelong glance at homosexuality. Jenks identified work by Philip Johnson, Paul Rudolph, Minoru Yamasaki, and Edward Durrell Stone, among others, as camp, hence my initial set of slides. By contrast, he grouped Charles Moore, Robert Venturi, Robert A.M. Stern, and others in the non-camp faction. Comparing work by Charles Moore, who was non-camp, and Philip Johnson, who was camp, I hope will demonstrate how badly Jenks's labels fit both architects' work and show the degree to which they efface the queer origins of this peculiar, particular postmodernism. I'd like to start with Moore and discuss the ways in which, in the same moment that Sontag published her famous essay, Moore designed with his partners, MLTW, this archetypal sea resort, the Sea Ranch condominium. And here you see the outside of the condominium complex itself, and this is his own condominium number 9, which was Moore's own house. The Sea Ranch condominium brought together the vernacular and camp in a vastly influential synthesis of California farm buildings, Bay Area regionalism, and pop graphic art. His own condominium, number 9, exhibited a camp mixture of objects, materials, and spaces, including these heavy gilt mirrors, a pony skin, super graphics, folk art, and the iconic exposed weathered boards. So this is really the image that first, so we say, got me onto Moore as a camp architect, because I couldn't reconcile this with his followers' account of Moore as essentially a modern architect who then became a postmodern architect and used classicism. This is a period in which his work really didn't seem to accommodate itself very well to any of the standard accounts. 2 years later, Moore transformed a small 19th century house in New Haven, where he was the head of the Yale School of Architecture, into another camp space. His house renovation challenged modernist creed and the constraints of good taste with an extended exercise in spatial complexity and unexpected juxtapositions. And this is Moore himself, down at the bottom of one of the tubes that he inserted into this little house. And you see the exterior of the house up there in the top right, the axonometric, and then the plans. There are 2-story towers of space, which he named Howard, Berengaria, and Ethel. This is Howard, this is Berengaria, and this is Ethel. I'm sorry, these images are just, the PowerPoint has done it again. But you can see them in the plan, I think, best. And, you know, well, I mean, obviously, that always elicits a laugh because even the names are a kind of extravagant, camp, funny character. These were made of double-layered plywood walls with large geometric cutouts, and they extended, Howard extended from the entrance on the main floor to the basement and contained a small desk, so that's Howard at the bottom. Berengaria rose from the main floor to the second floor and then up to the attic with a skylight and a roof. You can't really see that. You can see it in section, actually. And then Ethel dropped from a low skylit shed roof at the rear to the kitchen in the basement. And this is Ethel on the right. And that's part of Ethel also on Actually, both images are Ethel. Ethel was held up by rescued Corinthian columns that were topped off with lolly columns to make up their length. The disparate objects found in Moore's house formed a kind of camp inventory of supergraphics, salvaged columns, characters from popular theater and advertising. Little Orphan Annie is in there. Stained glass panels, Turkish carpets, Mexican pottery, exposed plumbing, a Wurlitzer jukebox, neon sculpture, negative positive design mode, motifs, etc. And my favorite image, of course, is the one on the left, which I think displays such extraordinary bad taste and such opulence, such extraordinary camp extravagance and opulence that it almost really needs no comment. But so here's St. Peter's Dome with the star-spangled, which I'll show you in a moment, a color image. It's red, the star-spangled roof, and then the fur bedspread. And because Moore was so historically acute, I'm sure this is a reference to Los's fur bedspread, because he's really dwelling in this realm of eclectic borrowing, but also in the kind of explicitly sensual references as well. And the reference to the Baroque, to mannerism, in fact, is not, again, it's not accidental. This is an ad, a figure from an ad from Volkswagen, billboard, the kind of broken columns. It's really an extraordinary vocabulary that he's developed in this one very small space. In 1969, Playboy magazine ran a spread on Moore's bachelor pad, dubbing it a flipped-out domain and inhabiting it with comely guests and a handsome stand-in for the hut with a chubby, bewhiskered Moore, who's described as a 43-year-old bachelor architect. And bachelor, of course, is kind of, again, a code. And it's, I'm not claiming Moore was gay. His associates tell me he was not, but bachelor and 43-year-old is sort of a code for someone who's probably not interested. So this is the spread, the New Haven Haven, and this is the closet door. This is one of the things that's featured in almost every picture of the closet doors with the numbers, the super graphics. There's Howard on the middle image, and there's the comely guest. There was a sauna, a kind of up in the attic, I believe. And here you can see his bed, but in fact, instead of the fur bedspread, it's replaced by a white vinyl bedspread, which is even more tasteless, I think. Unfortunately, the text reads like a straight piece of architectural criticism. There's none of the kind of elaboration that I think the images might suggest, the sort of sexual license and the freedom that the space seems to want to elicit. And instead, it's really just it's sort of straightforward description of the spaces and the architecture. Moore's experiments with camp continued in subsequent work. This is the faculty club at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which had the same sort of eclecticism. There's a tapestry, there's neon. There's a whole room filled with ram's heads, stuffed ram's heads. His house in Essex at Centerbrook was another camp assemblage of distinctive objects and references. I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly. But really his apogee as a camp architect was the Piazza d'Italia, 1976. He took the classical precedents and designed the piazza to look like a neon Italian square. Rather than make architecture that tried to imitate the historical forms, he made a colorful pastiche out of the classical vocabulary. And again, I think this idea of the pastiche, it's both parodic, because you can see there's elements that are borrowed from the Campidoglio. The columns themselves are both classical, but they're made out of mylar. And this kind of parodic element really links very closely to camp practice. This order was called the Deli Order. That's what he dubbed it, with neon necklaces. that further indicate that this is the 20th century and that commercial bad taste is part of it. So obviously, I think this is the kind of camp derivation with the glib silliness, tawdry materials, and excessive whimsical connotations, including these fountains, which are Morton South, spouting water. So there's a self-parody as well. Philip Johnson's New York State Theater at Lincoln Center and his New York State Pavilion for the World's Fair, 1964, are further examples of another side of camp, a kind of fake luxury that emerged in the 1960s. The State Theater at Lincoln Center, which you see here's Johnson pointing out the features, is, as you all probably know, is an attenuated travertine temple containing a foyer, the Grand Promenade, which has been likened to a prison cell block, and a mock elegant auditorium encrusted with rhinestone lights. The exterior is also encrusted with these big, huge rhinestone light fixtures. From the plaza level of Lincoln Center, one enters a low entrance foyer and then goes up one of two grand staircases into the galleried Grand Promenade. The galleries on the promenade give access to the auditorium in the manner of the Paris and Vienna opera houses. Johnson used travertine for the promenade floor, gold leaf for the ceiling, and bronze for the railings that surround the balconies. The New York State Theater represented Johnson's boldest effort to invent modernist analogs to classical architecture and decorative conventions. It projected a social vision of the theater's audiences as a glamorous elite whose public rituals occurred in a setting that assimilated the classical to the modern, much as Ballantyne's choreography did. And that's all very self-conscious. The New York State Pavilion was the largest state pavilion at the 1964-65 World's Fair, and one of the few buildings to survive, although it's now a ruin. Rather than conceive the pavilion as an enclosed building, Johnson created a circular open-air piazza paved with a map of New York State and terrazzo, which you see in the plan here. 12 hollow reinforced concrete columns, 100 feet high, supported a multicolored radial canopy, which was called the Tent of Tomorrow. That shaded the plaza. To either side of the entrance were a cylindrical theater, the Theaterama. The Theaterama is here. And 3 cylindrical concrete columns carrying viewing platforms and a restaurant, which are here. And those are the really iconic elements which you see in the perspective. In 1965, Tom Wolfe described the World's Fair as the restaurant up at the top is called the Top O' the Fair. The restaurant itself up there at the top turns out to be a great piece of 1930s modern elegance. Great slabs of glass, curved wood, wall-to-wall and everywhere. Huge plate glass views of the borough of Queens at night. Here you can see this. Henry Russell Hitchcock described this as a piece of pop architecture, saying it is a supposedly new phenomenon to decry the criterion of taste, that is, good taste. Strikingly evident in the works of the American painters of the last decade, it is indeed such a conscious rejection of good taste. This is a point of view in painting and sculpture with which Johnson has a great deal of sympathy, which I would say is true. The references to modern and modern style of these two buildings point to their precedents, their antecedents in less radical forms of modernism, and create what I would call a kind of camp luxury. The fantasy, of course, of a cultural acropolis for New York is part of Lincoln Center's essentially camp style, but Johnson took the State Theater further to the edge of good taste. Its stylization of classical styles recalls French classicism of the 30s, with its mannered joints between columns and cornice, the chamfered column detailing, and even the bead curtains hung on the Grand Promenade windows, parody serious classical buildings, including, I would say, the serious classical buildings at Lincoln Center. The plastic headlight fixtures clustered on the exterior colonnade, which unfortunately you can't see so well here, but there are also those headlights outside, are a witty lampoon of the diamonds that women wear to the theater. The camp luxury of travertine, gold leaf, and bronze evoke traditional honorific spaces, but act as, quote, things being what they are not, in its Sontag's words, which recalls Mark Booth's acerbic characterization of camp taste. Mark Booth is one of the important theorists of camp. He says, Versailles stands in camp memory, not as it was intended as a symbol of decorative absolutism, but as a symbol of absolute decorativism. And I would say that you can say that about these two buildings as well. The State Pavilion exudes camp's perverseness with the goal of humor, with the overblown circus tent, the spiky Wrightian ornaments, the billboard display for art on the Theaterama, and its top-heavy discus towers. According to C. Ray Smith, camp architectural whimsy manifested itself in spatial puns and visual jokes, in the humorous use of connotative items, materials, and colors, and in surprise juxtapositions. It seems to me that the New York State Pavilion exhibits exactly those same qualities, this kind of perverseness and this deliberate wit. Skip some of this in the interest of time. I think what camp allowed Moore and Johnson to do was to access both gay and non-gay codes of representation and to interject previously taboo elements of design that had been banned by modernism's masculinist regime, in particular ornament. With camp's ascendancy, the gay subculture gained a brief legitimacy as the style au courant. In a few places, such as West Hollywood, it even came out in the form of what architect John Chase calls exterior decoration. These are two images of West Hollywood houses. West Hollywood is called Gay Town. It is really the gay neighborhood of the West of Los Angeles. And John Chase has analyzed these houses, many of which were designed by people who worked in the film industry. And they would transform their little bungalows into these extravagant, usually classical fantasies. And this style, in fact, was analyzed by Charles Jenks in the language of postmodern architecture in the first edition in 1977. These are further images from John Chase's book. And then this is the image that appears, these are two of the images that appear in Jenks's book. He calls this style gay eclectic and lauded its witty use of architectural codes as language, and in fact holds this up as an example of the semiotic use of classical language and its potential for postmodern architecture. And you can see these were done, I believe, by architecture students at UCLA in the 1970s, and then Jenks published in his book. So we see an example of code dissemination is the way this is being used. He praised the, quote, interior decorators who go exterior on their bungalows, converted bungalows whose sex has changed from 1930s Spanish to 1970s Rococola and other modes. In subsequent editions of the language of postmodern architecture, Jenks used terms with overt camp meanings, such as travesty, parody, and whimsy, to define the semantic operation of postmodernist architecture. But the queer camp origins of these practices were effaced by Jenks when he theorized postmodernism itself. He termed it gay radical eclecticism, thereby suppressing the gay referent. This is consistent with camp's absorption into mainstream culture and the subsequent erasure of its origins in gay subculture. And in fact, I believe that this refusal of camp's place is haunted by the figure of the interior decorator, the least authoritative and most camp figure in design. Jenks goes so far as to blame the timidity with which architects adopted the classical language on, quote, a fear of meeting interior decorators and reactionaries coming back the other way. Nevertheless, part of camp's queer power lies in its continued potential to muddle up categories and mix audiences, and challenge simultaneously the subtle hierarchies of taste and sexuality. Mark Booth asserts that the primary type of marginal in society is the traditionally feminine, which camp parodies as in an exhibition of stylized effeminacy. Moore's and Johnson's camp postmodernism was a parody of the limp-wristed decorator's style, a subversion of modern architecture's masculinist culture, performed with exaggerated artifice. Rather than substituting a true or a real aesthetic for modernism's symbolic order, however, they instigated a self-conscious, trashy campiness. And I just have to finish with this image, which comes from C. Ray Smith's Supermodernism. About the time he designed the Piazza d'Italia, Moore himself achieved a kind of apotheosis from mild-mannered architect into supermannerist hero. Venturi says, along with Robert Venturi. Robert Venturi says, "Ha! I welcome the problems and exploit the uncertainties. I aim for vitality as well as validity." And Moore says, "I include irreverence and puncture whatever architectural balloons I can find lying around." In this parodic inhabitation of the superhero, the Venturi and Moore figures give us a concise synopsis of a camp program: the distant, parodic, and humorous deflation of modernism in its masculine symbolic order. Far from an unproblematically manly architect superhero a la Howard Rourke, Venturi and Moore give us the laughing, queer camp heroes, creators of fabulous sublime excess. Thank you.
Pat will answer a few questions.
Yes.
But could you draw a distinction between camp and kitsch, just for the sake of
Sure. Yeah, that was a part that I had to cut out. I mean, you can kind of get into a whole discussion. Kitsch has a very long history, and its use began in the 19th century in reference to a very particular bad taste in Germany, and it was associated with kind of lower class taste. It was a very class-oriented term. And then when Greenberg picks that up in the 30s, he writes his famous book, essay on kitsch in 37, he associates that with a kind of degenerate folk art that tries to imitate high culture, but does so with mass appeal. And it's very strongly linked with fascism in the 30s. Camp has its origins. It's a term that really started to be associated with homosexual culture in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. And one of the first references is from about 1901, in reference to exaggeration and sort of marginal characters. And its reception then in the 60s really has to do with this gay subculture, with the sort of the language of homosexuals who aren't out, who are living in an underground world. And it's associated with interior decoration and certain kinds of forms of, what's the word? Very specifically gay culture. I mean, I'm using that anachronistically again, but it's very closely aligned with homosexuality.
Is there also a distinction in terms of self-consciousness?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the distinctions that's made is the kitsch. Well, actually, there's also a distinction made between pop and camp, which is that pop, in a sense, comes out of a certain kind of disgust with commercial culture. That it actually is not particularly celebratory. It's critical. It's distanced. Whereas camp, at least in the theory, is more celebratory and it's more naive or serious, but it's failed seriousness, and in that way it's closer to kitsch. But there, the historical origins of the terms are a little bit different.
It's interesting that if we accept that this is grounded in the marginal, this notion of a kind of profligate use of historic signs, and then the assertion, the over-assertion of signs, and it's that kind of over-assertion, like the hypermuscularity of the Superman character. It's the pushing of the semiotic reading that in fact is the subversive element. It's interesting then if you continue to trace the kind of postmodern trajectory and think about Jenks, who's writing about this in the 70s, late 70s, and Philip Johnson is just beginning to use this word when he does the AT&T parallel. And then we think about the almost complete assimilation of a postmodern sensibility into corporate culture. Will you at all talk about this kind of leap from the margins to the most kind of vested sort of capitalistic engagement with which postmodernism performs the same kind of mask that was done in an earlier vein by the marginal culture?
It's a complicated question. No, that's okay. It's a good question. Yes, and the sort of the superficial way of answering that question is, well, at this moment in the 60s and by the early 70s, camp is still operating, and the kind of eclecticism of camp is still operating on the margins by architects who are not then themselves particularly famous or don't have that kind of corporate sponsorship. But it is a certain attempt, and at the very same moment, you can see architects who, in fact, are really operating more in the corporate, what becomes the kind of corporate postmodern mode. But the historical moment, I think, is important to recuperate because it does point to a certain investigation which was really abandoned. Moore himself never did this kind of work after a certain point in the 70s, I would say around 78. He really adopts classicism wholeheartedly, and it becomes a much more literally historicist project. And it's precisely that element of push. It is still exaggerated, but the whimsy, the wit, and the kind of commentary, the critical edge is really lost. And in that sense, it's no longer a camp exercise. Because of that, that's precisely what I'm interested in, is the moment in which you can have both the parody and the critical edge. And I think there's institutional reasons for that shift. That's something that I would like to look more at. By the time Supermannerism is published in '77, most of that work is well behind these architects. Piazza d'Italia is really the last gasp of that particular type of work. And I think it has to do with the movement of these architects, the trajectory of their careers away from the margins itself. It's difficult to imagine some of these architects doing the same sorts of work for the kinds of clients that they had.
It's interesting because, and this goes back to Randall's question about kitsch and camp, one can see the same sort of semiotic structures in a kind of kitsch way in New Urbanism or many of the kind of new town developments which take on spatial tropes as well as scenographic tropes from facades. And so the difference, if I comprehend, is the moment that you're looking at is when history is still used to critique or comment on that history, as opposed to be using something which is purposely used to seriously present an identity.
Right.
Like you use classicism because you want to be seen as serious. So when a bank uses classicism in a facade, or when AT&T uses classicism, it's really about reinforcing the older codes and identities rather than this moment where there tends to be a kind of
I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, I think that's right. But I think also what you see is that this work mixes the codes. And that's part of what doesn't happen later. I mean, if you look at the work of the New Historicism, they're very consistent stylistically. So you use a code. So Bob Stern will use, he'll use 30s modernism for a cartoon animation studio, but he'll use classicism for the headquarters. So there's a sense that the codes are not getting mixed, and the critique is certainly lost. but it's also much more literally historicist. This work is not historicist per se. It's really using, Venturi's method is really to use history as a kind of grab bag, and then you borrow according to the designer's whim in part, but also as a way of critiquing modernism and its codes. And it's about a way of also revealing the codes and the kind of strictures of modernism as well, and revealing their degree, their relationship to history.
Here's a trial balloon. I really liked your talk, and it sort of brought together certain sort of hunches I've had about this period of work. But is it possible to say that camp, especially as embodied in the early work of Charles Moore, really is about the presentation of a subjective identity? Because one of the things, I'm saying that partly because one of the things that always struck me about Moore's early work is that there's always a place for the body. It's always about viewing, it's always about display. I mean, even that one image that you had, well, that, but also the interior, of course. Yeah, oh, absolutely. You know, or the way he writes about his own house in Orinda,
Right.
or even the one image of condominium number 9 where there's that brightly colored little balcony that's the kind of the papal balcony. And it seems to me that that's something very distinctive about camp versus, say, kitsch, which from the little I remember when I was reading about kitsch was much more about the creation of a domestic environment, a more complete environment, rather than, say, again, emphasizing a coded self. So, I don't know. What do you think?
That's interesting. No, I haven't thought it in those terms. I'm really resisting equating this work with subjective identity, in part because I think that that's very difficult to sort out. I mean, Johnson was out after a certain point, but it's so I'm also, I'm a kind of a Bardian girl. I really do believe in the death of the author in some way. That said, I think that that's an interesting idea that, in fact, rather than reading it as a projection of Moore's own identity per se, you would read it as the spaces that give the possibility of an identity being formed, and that's open-ended. And that's part of what I think is very beautiful about these spaces, is that they don't code for a particular set of references. That there's a lot of possibilities that are opened up, in fact, when you use the code so freely, when you use languages, when you're using references. And so although they're very personal in a way, they are not, they're not projecting status and power and money and so forth in the traditional ways that these languages are usually used for. That was very, very conscious on Moore's part, certainly. If you read The Place of Houses, if you read a lot of his polemics in this period, and of course he talks about the body quite explicitly, he's really writing against the strictures of good taste, the taste hierarchies, the people who tell you this is how you should be, and he's really, you think about who his contemporaries were, Paul Rudolph and others, people who really did, who had a very particular vision of modernism and were willing to enforce that on any client and any function, then Moore's work becomes particularly radical in that context. And I think Johnson was playing with those codes as well, in a much more self-consciously, subversive is not the right word, but I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was espousing bad taste in a very kind of open-ended, open-minded way, I think. That's not quite the word I wanted to use, but actually you had a question.
Yes. I was wondering what relationship you draw between, and that's probably obvious in your research, between camp subculture and Hollywood industrial movies, entertainment in general. Because it seems to me that this whole approach of the decorative, especially in the interiors, is very laden by a Hollywood vision of what decoration could be. And when you brought this quote from this author regarding the side, it's obviously they're not looking at Versailles as such, but they're looking
Right,
at
right.
with Marie Antoinette
Yeah.
probably, right? Or Versailles seen through
Versailles,
Hollywood.
right, yeah.
Or yeah.
Sophia Coppola's vision of
And-
Versailles.
right.
Yeah, Mario Bellini.
And how
right,
can it be
Bellini
actually
Shelley.
at once a subculture which is camp and private and secret, and a very strong relationship to the most powerful cultural product of American history?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, John Chase does some of that work already in Exterior Decoration, which is a really brilliant book, and it should be republished because it's got so much good material in it. And he talks about how there is a vision of glamour, which is created by Hollywood, which is really interiorized mainly by interior decoration and used quite flamboyantly by the gay subculture. But then it really comes into the public world. It becomes a public statement of identity and of a neighborhood. It becomes part of the collective identity of West Hollywood, which is filled with people working in the industry. But it's really that moment when it kind of emerges from the subculture that's interesting both to John Chase and to me, when it ceases to simply be a private expression and becomes part of more public architecture, the public realm. In that case, it's still ghettoized. But what I'm really interested in is that moment in the 60s when it starts to become part of mainstream discourse and part of mainstream culture and mainstream architecture. Although you could argue that Moore's a pretty marginal figure in the 60s, nevertheless, he's the head of School of Architecture. He's, deeply entrenched in the hierarchy of the architectural hierarchy. And I think there's a book, Alice Friedman is publishing a book on glamour and its relationship to architecture, which relates very closely to what I'm working on as well. That there is this notion of it's aristocratic taste, which is basically taken, it's democratized, it really becomes accessible to anyone. And there's some really interesting work in cultural studies on the relationship between gay subcultural taste and this desire for this hankering after high class, the forms of luxury and opulence that Versailles represents. And it does become democratized. And that actually happens in France in the 19th century. It happens in America. The rise of, mass production of furniture, so anyone can have a Louis Couture's chair, Louis Quinze chair. That, I think, it's part of the same phenomenon, but in a sense it's background, because there is this particular historical moment when it really comes out, as it were.
I'm very intrigued, Pat, by the case of Paul Rudolph, because you focused on Charles Moore and Philip Johnson, and in both cases we can read marginality into their biographies. With Johnson, the ultimate insider, but gay, and so we can read a certain marginality there. Charles Moore, marginal in a different kind of way, and either crypto homosexual or this great boy appropriating the gay strategies. And the parallel to Greg Lynn is very strong with Charles Moore. And the Sladen House, especially, you didn't show the version with the guilt. The version shown in Mocha in an architecture and fashion show is even more of a strong parallel to Moore. And the institutional embeddedness of Lynn and Moore is their strong parallels there as well. And the Yale connection. But Johnson, it seems to me, Rudolph raises a whole different set of issues, because what I remember from Tim Rowan's analysis is that the Yale Art and Architecture building is butch. It's not camp.
It's not a
unless, you could call it kitsch, which of course is a way of developing. One could call it kitsch, which is a way of pulling the rug out from under Rudolph's hyper-masculinity. But I think from Rudolph's perspective, it's butch. And when you stretch camp to include Rudolph, I think it immediately makes me think of people, Eisenman. Strong parallel to Rudolph in the sense that he took what he was doing very seriously. I could call his early work from this period kitsch, in the same way that we could call Rudolph's work kitsch by trying to be so butch that it becomes laughable. And the hyper, the intensity of Eisenman's early work is could be read in very parallel ways. And
then also the tectonic articulation that Frampton, has always clamored for, I think is another form of butch architecture. And so I think the case of Rudolph, because he doesn't fit Camp very well, and I think it's only because he was gay that you're stretching and that we stretch
Right.
the Camp label to include Rudolph. It's only because we know that biographically he was gay. Or we would say his penthouse.
That's right.
Well,
That's what I'll say.
which I cut out, yeah, I actually had that in here,
But the Yale
but I
building-
cut it out, yeah.
The Yale building is maybe a different animal, and I think it potentially raises some interesting questions about the more, about the Eisenman work, about Frampton.
Those are fantastic parallels, yeah. I would contend, I would say that, no, I didn't include him because he's homosexual, per se. In fact, I've thought about that a lot, and that's that sort of equation of biography with the work that I'm resisting very strongly. I include him, though, as a naive camp architect, not as a deliberate camp architect, not primarily because of it is a kind of butch, yeah. But I would say that it's a sort of it's the decorative aspects that were camp for me. And the idea of this, it's not tectonic, in fact. It looks tectonic, but it isn't. And the building, the surface is really what convinced me that this might be, in fact, accommodated to camp. Although it doesn't, it's obviously not, it's not exaggerated in effeminacy, for sure.
But it's
It's
hyper masculine.
Tomophonic, yeah. And in that way, I think that if we're talking about camp as a subversion of norms, this, I think, really does, I think it accommodates the camp label pretty well. But that's certainly not, in terms of the naive and the deliberate, that's a distinction that Sontag makes, which I think, it's only really useful for this kind of taxonometric exercises. It's actually not really a very useful analytical tool. But I think there is a sort of camp quality to the emphasis of the surface and the decorative elements of which are tough, which are, as you say, butch. Nevertheless, I think there is a camp quality to them, and especially because it is so exaggerated, and the scalelessness of it, the ways in which it loses that sense of the tectonic that modernism has, or even, there's just, they're very different, obviously, but even Yamasaki, there's a sense of what the structure is, even if it's then embellished and decorative and becomes really quite out of control. And you don't have that with the Rudolph, but it's a really interesting question. And I have to think about it.
Or Calatrava, Yamasaki. I think your analysis could show us contemporary work in
Yeah.
these ways.
Yeah. No, and I'm trying to develop that, but I'm also trying to be true to the historic moment, and it's kind of a balance in there.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.